Hi guys, we are back with Basic Plant Science Lab number 7. The semester is going by so fast. As I've told you, summer semesters do that. But we've already had our first exam. Many of you did very, very well in scoring almost perfect scores. I think we did have a couple perfect scores. Some of you need to work a little bit harder on prepping for exams. I know they're a little different than the assignments in that they're timed. But in general, keep up the good work, and just if you need help about how to study or want some suggestions, please look at the study tips that I posted on Blackboard. In fact, before we get started with the 7th lab, let me close out of this real quick. Whoops. And let's look at Blackboard real quick. So here we go. This is the Blackboard page. You guys should be able to see this as I share it. And so when you go to the Blackboard page, the first thing you'll see, right, is the announcements. And then in the course document folders, just to get you guys should already know this, but just in case, I want to pull up the lab manual to kind of show you. So the last 4 labs, 7, 8, 9, 10, right, kind of all focus on the plant kingdom. So the plant kingdom at large. So far in the course, we've really looked at plants and parts of plants and how plants grow and how plants germinate from a seed in some cases, right? Now we're going to actually look at parts of the plant kingdom. And so the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th lab, we're going to be basically walking through the plant kingdom to get to know the key players in the plant kingdom. Okay. Let me make this small. Also now I think you should be able to, going forward, since I've posted the instructions as to how to look at your correct and incorrect answers on your assignments. So that information is now posted on Blackboard as an announcement, gives you the steps of how you can see your submitted assignments. And please turn in the assignments. Turn in the assignments on time. The syllabus says all of the due dates of the assignments. And so we need to submit them, and we need to submit them on time. We're running out of time. The semester is almost over, so we need to get to work. Okay. Enough of that. All right, so let's jump in. So one of the reasons I'm recording today's lecture is because it's long. This is a long lecture. We're going to cover a lot of material today. Part of that is because you guys are not science majors. You don't have a science background. Some of you might be in the lecture of basic plant science, which is great. That'll help you understand this material. But some of you may not be in the lecture, and therefore I have to take the responsibility upon myself to kind of get you up to speed rather than just throw information at you. I have to kind of get you oriented first. So I'm recording this lecture so that you can watch it, and if need be, pause and take breaks, because as I said, we're going to cover quite a bit of information today. Let's get to it. Yep, so last class you guys had your lab exam. There will be one more lab exam on the last day of class, which is, I think, July 2nd. I'll have to double check that. It's in the syllabus. And today we're going to cover a lot. We're going to cover a little bit about cell division, so big sciencey words like mitosis and meiosis. We have to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about this new concept to all of you, which is alternation of generations. Maybe if you're in the lecture class, you might have talked about this a little bit, but we're going to talk about it today so that you guys understand what we're talking about in Basic Plant Science Lab. And then we're going to get introduced to the nonvascular plants, so the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts. And then just briefly at the end, we're going to talk about something called asexual reproduction. All right, so first we need to talk about cell division, right? Mitosis versus meiosis. So all living things undergo mitosis in their cells. So mitosis is a process that allows for cells to grow in numbers and also to repair damaged body cells. So mitosis occurs in body cells, which are diploid, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, or 2N. And mitosis is a process of cell division. So cells are going to divide. One cell is going to divide into other cells. And the result of mitosis is two cells. So you go from one cell to two cells, and the two cells are going to be genetically identical in that they have the same chromosome number, and they're going to have the same chromosome number as each other, the two, but they're also going to have the same chromosome number as the original cell that divided. So I know this seems like, what? But hold on. We're going to walk through it. Don't get scared. So here's a nice schematic of the process of mitosis. Here, I will annotate. Yay. Let me grab a color here. All right. Right? So mitosis, you start with a cell. This is a cell that is diploid, which is 2N, which we'll talk about what that means in a second. And this diploid cell is going to undergo changes that we are not going to have to cover, but it's going to undergo changes, and stuff's going to happen, and it's going to divide into two cells. And at the end of that process, the two cells are going to have the same chromosome number as each other, 2N, and they're going to have the same chromosome number as the original or mother cell. So this cell we call the mother cell. It's just what we call it. But this is the mother cell, and then the mother cell is going to divide and create what we call two daughter cells. There's one there, there's one there. So here's a nice summary at the bottom, right? You have a mother cell that's 2N, undergoes mitosis, and at the end of that, you have two daughter cells that are both also 2N. Okay, so that's mitosis. So why? Why are we learning this? What does it all mean? Mitosis is important. So you can't grow into an adult if you don't do mitosis, right? If you're a child and your body needs to grow, right? Your arm needs to get longer. You need to get taller, right? You need to grow different things in your body. And that doesn't just happen by magic. That happens because cells will divide. So let's say my arm is getting longer, right? So I need more skin cells to cover my arm if my arm's going to get longer. And the only way that's going to happen is if the existing cells, the body cells, right, undergo this division, and then that creates more skin cells, right? That are identical to the mother cell and identical to each other. So we need mitosis in order to grow. And just like we need mitosis in order to grow, plants need mitosis in order to grow, right? So you can't go from a seed to a tree by magic. You have to go, the cells that are in that seed, in that embryo of that plant, are going to need to undergo mitosis in order to grow things like the radicle, and grow things like the plumule, and grow things like the shoot apex and the root apex, and eventually go through primary and secondary growth, right? All of that will happen because of mitosis. Likewise, if something gets damaged, we need to repair it. So if you've ever scraped your knee, or you had some sort of injury, your body heals, and the way that your body heals is the cells that are next to that injury will divide via mitosis to create new cells that can replace the damaged cells. Likewise, on the right here, we see a tree that somebody is broken a limb off, right? A branch off of this tree, and the tree is damaged now. And if the tree needs to repair itself, and the way it's going to do that is via mitosis, if it can repair itself. Okay, so that's mitosis. Mitosis is for body cells, right? Growth and repair. So if you think of mitosis, you should think growth. It's a process of cell division. It's for growth and repair, and the original cell is 2N or diploid. It's a body cell. It's going to undergo mitosis, turn into two cells that are both also diploid, right? Like two new skin cells or something like that. So they're genetically identical in chromosome number 2N from each other and the original mother cell, right? Okay. Now we have to talk about meiosis. So meiosis is not for body cells. Meiosis is specifically for making gametes, egg and sperm. So when you think gametes, you want to think egg and sperm. Gametes, egg and sperm. Gametes, egg and sperm, right? Gametes are egg and sperm. And that's what meiosis is for. Meiosis is for making egg and sperm gametes. And so meiosis does not occur in the body cells, right? My skin cells are not going to undergo meiosis. They occur only in sex cells, right? So parts of the body that are designed to make eggs and make sperm are those tissues are going to be where meiosis is occurring. And what happens in meiosis is you start off with a cell that's 2N, right? Let's say in the testes, right? Or in the ovules, in the ovaries. You start out with a cell that is 2N or diploid, and that cell is going to undergo a process that you don't need to know the details of, but that process is going to cause the chromosome number of the original cell to be reduced. It's still a process of cell division, just like mitosis is a type of cell division. This is also a process of cell division, but now the products are a total of 4 cells, and each of those cells is going to be haploid or 1N. So the daughter cells that result, the 4 daughter cells that result, are going to have the same chromosome number as each other, 1N, but they're going to have half of the chromosome number than the mother cell, which had 2N. The mother cell had 2N. All 4 daughter cells are going to have 1N. Again, you don't need to know the details of how that occurs, except that it occurs. Except you need to know that it occurs. So here on the right, we have another schematic. Here we have our original mother cell, which is 2N or diploid, which we'll talk about that in a second. And this is going to go through processes. You don't need to know all the details, but ultimately the final product is going to be 4 daughter cells that are each haploid or 1N. So we went from a diploid mother cell to 4 haploid daughter cells. And we say that on the bottom here. Meiosis occurs, 4 daughter cells that are each 1N. All right. So that's a crash course through some of the most important parts of biology in general. It's meiosis and mitosis. These are very important cellular processes that dictate our existence in a lot of ways. Okay, so in humans, when humans have meiosis occur in their sex organs, in their sex tissues, the result of that meiosis is, boom, gametes. So in humans, when meiosis occurs, the immediate product of that meiosis is gametes. So if you were talking about male sex organs, let's say the testes, if meiosis occurred in the testes, the immediate result would be 4 sperm cells. If meiosis occurred in the ovaries, the immediate result would be, boom, 4 egg cells, right? For our purposes, that's fine. And so here's a schematic showing that. Walk you through this schematic so that it makes sense, right? So here is a representative of, like, let's say a cell in the testes, right? Let's say this is a tissue of cells in the testes, right? A diploid individual, but let's say this is in the testes, a bunch of cells in the testes. One of those cells, which is a mother cell, still called a mother cell, even if it's leading to sperm. The mother cell would be 2N, and this cell is going to undergo meiosis. Remember, we're talking in humans right now. The mother cell is going to undergo meiosis. The result is 4 daughter cells, which in this case will be sperm. And, oh, yeah. And so this, I got to take a step back here. Hold on. Kind of messed up here. This is trying to show both male and female on one slide, which is kind of silly, but don't worry about that too much. The point is, all right, you have diploid cells in the sex organs of an animal, right? Like a human. Those diploid cells are going to undergo meiosis, right? So here's one of those cells, and this cell is 2N. If you are in the testes, you're going to create sperm. Here are 2 of the 4 sperm. If you're in the ovaries, you're going to make eggs. Here are 2 of the 4 eggs. And ultimately, what will need to happen is that one of the sperm and one of the eggs will have to unite to make a zygote, right? A 2N individual. Hold tight, hold tight. So the main takeaway message of this slide is that in humans and other animals, when meiosis occurs, the immediate product is gametes, egg and sperm. That's the take-home message here. So then I said I was going to talk a little bit more about diploid, right? And what that means. So I guess if I said, a skin cell has a certain number of chromosomes, and if it's going to divide to make other skin cells, it would make sense that they would just have the same number of chromosomes, right? Because a skin cell is a skin cell, right? A bone cell is a bone cell, etc. A blood cell is a blood cell, right? So like if it's going to make more of the same thing, it should have the same chromosome number, and that's what we see in mitosis. However, in meiosis, you have 4 daughter cells, right? 4 cells that have half of the original cell. Well, why do we have to do that? Well, here's why. Because we're talking about gametes. Meiosis leads to gametes, right? Leads to gametes. So in humans, directly leads to gametes. So let's look at this slide really quick. Why can't, I already had it on. So here is a human being, just as a circle, right? Here is a human being, and the human being is diploid. In the case of human beings, our chromosome number is 46. 40, where is my, hold on, I lost my cursor here. Here we go. Here is a human being, and a human being is 2N or diploid. And what that means is, in the case of humans, we have a total of 46 chromosomes in our cells, right? In our cells, we have 46 chromosomes. Half of those chromosomes came from our mom, and half of those chromosomes came from our dad, hence the 2N. So mom would have given you 23 chromosomes. Dad would have given you, so each of those people is an N, right? Mom would have given you 23 chromosomes. Dad would have given you 23 chromosomes with a fusion of egg and sperm, and that would have resulted in an individual, which is 2N or diploid. So here we go. Look, meiosis. So here's an individual. In this case, meiosis occurred. Don't worry about cytokinesis. And the result of meiosis was sperm. The sperm has half the number of chromosomes as the original cell, right? Half, 23. In this other individual, meiosis occurred, and the result is egg cells. Those egg cells also have half the original number of the individual human that they came from. And when egg and sperm unite via fertilization, the product or the zygote that results will be another diploid individual. So meiosis is important because if we didn't have that, sperm would have 46 chromosomes in it, and egg would have 46 chromosomes in it. And the result would be an individual with 92 chromosomes, right? Then now that individual is going to make sperm or eggs and have 92 chromosomes in their sperm or egg? It won't work. So in order for sex cells to create a new individual, they have to have half the chromosome number that the original organism did, right? Mm-hmm. And different organisms have different numbers of chromosomes. So for example, in humans, I said if you looked at your skin cells, they all have 46 chromosomes in there. But not everything has 46. So instead of worrying about how many chromosomes are in each living thing in the world, we use these terminologies of diploid, which means 2N, and haploid, which just means N. Okay. So in humans, meiosis leads directly to gametes, egg, and sperm. And this is telling you a little bit more about diploid versus haploid. All right. That's in humans and other animals. In plants, it's more complicated. In plants, it is more complicated. Let me drink my tea. It's hard to talk for so long. It's very hard. You have to have, I got tea back here. I have seltzer back here. I have water back here. I'm good. Okay. So in plants, it's more complicated. In plants, meiosis, the direct product of meiosis is something called a spore. And that spore is going to grow into an individual, and that individual is going to be what produces the gametes. So there's a whole extra step than what we had in humans. In humans, meiosis happens and boom, you have egg and sperm. In plants, meiosis happens and now you have a spore. The spore is going to grow into something, which is a type of plant, and that plant is going to be the thing that will produce the gametes, egg and sperm. So this schematic, similar to the one I showed you before, it's just showing you that extra step in that, here is our diploid plant individual. Don't worry about sporophyte yet. We'll talk about that in a second. So here's our diploid plant individual. It has cells that are going to undergo meiosis. However, now, because we're talking about plants, the cells that result, the 4 daughter cells, are not going to be gametes, egg, and sperm. They're going to be spores. Those spores are going to grow into haploid individuals. See here? Haploid plant individuals. And those haploid plant individuals are going to be the things that make the gametes. So this concept is a little tricky to kind of wrap your head around, even for science majors. So don't feel overwhelmed. I'm going to walk us through it slowly now to kind of understand it better. But if you're feeling a little, right now, don't feel like that yet. Don't feel like that yet. I'm going to walk you through this, and it will take some repetition. You might have to watch this part of this a few times because this is one of the more complex concepts of this course. Okay, so just to rewind, right? In animals, meiosis leads to, boom, egg and sperm, gametes. But in plants, meiosis leads to spores. Spores are going to grow into plants, and those plants are going to be what makes the gametes, egg, and sperm. What does that mean? That means that plants actually have 2 generations. 2 generations, that's right. 2 generations for one life cycle. 2. So humans, we have 1 generation for our life cycle. Plants have 2 generations to complete one life cycle. I know. And that's called alternation of generations. And so alternation of generations is one of the most important thing about understanding plants, because all plants do alternation of generations. And now that we know what meiosis and mitosis are, and now that we understand the differences of what results from meiosis in humans versus plants, now we can talk about alternation of generations in a little bit more detail. It won't be as scary. Okay. So when I'm saying 2 generations, whoa, you kind of might be like, what does that even mean, Rebecca? Like, I have no idea. Why are you even excited? Well, because it is exciting. So here's a more maybe familiar example to what you already know, right? So think of something like a butterfly, right? A butterfly can't exist without at first having been a caterpillar, right? You had to have a caterpillar walking around as a caterpillar individual. Here I am, I'm a caterpillar. And that caterpillar will have to undergo things, and then boom, now we have a butterfly, right? So for one life cycle, you had to have 2 separate things, caterpillar, butterfly, for one life cycle. And even though this is a good way to kind of think about having 2 organisms during one life cycle, it's not exactly the same as what is happening in plants. Not exactly the same, but it's a good place to kind of get your mind wrapped around, okay, one life cycle, but 2 separate stages. 2 separate stages. Okay. Alternation of generation. So all plants, every single plant, undergo alternation of generations, all of them. And what alternation of generations is it's an alternation between a haploid plant and a diploid plant for one life cycle. Haploid plant, diploid plant. Haploid generation, diploid generation. Haploid generation, diploid generation. One life cycle will have one of each. And the Diploid, let's just pull this apart here. The diploid generation is called the sporophyte plant. And the haploid generation is called the gametophyte plant. So diploid generation is called sporophyte plant. Haploid generation is called gametophyte plant. So for every plant life cycle, you will have a haploid gametophyte plant and a diploid sporophyte plant. Those are big loaded words. Let's pull them apart, which always helps me understanding these larger words. So sporophyte plant, right? The diploid individual. Sporo means spores. Sporo means spores. Sporo. Phyte means plant. Phyte. Sporophyte, spores plant. This is a plant, a phyte, that is going to make spores. Sporophyte, a phyte that makes sporos, right? A plant that makes spores. And it's diploid. A gametophyte, remember gametes, egg and sperm? Gametophyte plant, gameto means gametes. Sorry, I should have drawn, I kept going. Gameto means gametes, gameto. Phyte means plant again, phyte. This is a phyte or a plant that makes gametes, egg and sperm. This is a phyte or a plant that makes sporos, right? Spores. Sporophyte plant, gametophyte plant. Sporophyte plant is diploid. Haploid is the gametophyte plant, right? The gametophyte plant is haploid. All right. So this might, again, just starting to learn this. So you just stay with me, be taking notes, but we're just starting to learn this. So that sporophyte plant is going to be the plant that makes the spores, right? And so remember, in plants, the spores are haploid. And so the sporophyte plant is going to be the one that there's going to be area where meiosis is occurring to make those spores. However, the gametophyte plant is, and those spores are going to grow into the gametophyte plant. The spores are going to grow into the gametophyte plant. And that gametophyte plant, which is haploid, all parts of that gametophyte plant are haploid, or 1N, is going to then produce gametes, egg and sperm. And we will walk through that now, I'm pretty sure. Oh, yeah. And then just before we walk through it, we have to have a few other important terms in order to understand this process. So we have sporophyte plant, right? Plant that makes spores. Gametophyte plant, plant that makes gametes, egg and sperm. On the sporophyte plant, you're going to have a sporangium, which is the singular, or many sporangia, plural. And sporangia are organs that produce the spores. So they will be the site of meiosis. On the gametophyte plant, you're going to have organs that make egg and sperm. So the organ that makes sperm is called an antheridium. Antheridium, plural antheridia. And the structure on the gametophyte plants that are going to make eggs are called archegonium, plural archegonia. Okay. So now we know a little bit about meiosis. We know a little bit about mitosis. We know a little bit about alternation of generations in plants. We know there are 2 generations in one life cycle, a sporophyte plant and a gametophyte plant. And we know that the sporophyte plant is going to make spores and the gametophyte plant is going to make egg and sperm. So let's walk through a life cycle so this makes more sense. Okay, so here we go. We have a sporophyte plant, right? A sporophyte plant, which is diploid. And in this slides that I'm about to go through, the diploid structures or organisms are in blue, and the haploid structures or organisms are going to be in like a yellow color. So here we have our sporophyte plant and it's diploid. On that sporophyte plant, right, plant that makes spores, on that sporophyte plant is going to be a sporangium, which is the organ that makes spores. Inside of that organ the sporangium that makes spores, there's going to be cells that are diploid that are going to go through process to become spores, right? And those are the spore mother cells, which are diploid. The spore mother cells are going to undergo meiosis, right? Because we have to make spores, and spores are haploid, and so we have to reduce the chromosome number in half. And so the spore mother cells that are found inside that sporangium that is located on that sporophyte plant are going to undergo meiosis. And those cells are going to, the result is going to be 4 spores, right? And that's what tetrad means, 4. Tetrad means a group of 4 things. So the meiosis is going to create 4 spores for each mother cell. So now we break those spores apart, and we're only going to talk about 1 spore, right? So we had 4 that were the result of meiosis. Now we're only going to talk about 1. That spore is going to grow. So that spore is going to get released from the sporangium, and it's going to grow into the gametophyte plant, right? Gameto, right? Gametes, phyte plant, so a plant that makes gametes, egg, and sperm. On that gametophyte plant, there are organs that make egg and sperm, right? The antheridium is going to make sperm. The archegonium is going to make egg. Notice the color change, right? So we were in diploid, which is blue. Now, since meiosis occurred, we are in haploid, right? 1N. So there you go. Antheridium makes sperm, which is 1N. Archegonium makes egg, which is also 1N. Eventually, the sperm and the egg are going to fuse together in a process known as fertilization. And the result is the new sporophyte plant, which begins as an embryo, right? Just egg and sperm fused, and then is going to grow into, begins as a zygote, egg and sperm fused, will grow into an embryo or a young plant. And then over time, the embryo will grow into the sporophyte plant. Okay. So on this slide that we're looking at right now, kind of only see 2 processes, right? You see a process of meiosis, which occurred in the sporangium when that spore mother cell underwent meiosis to result in the tetrad of spores. And you see this process of fertilization where sperm and egg came together to fuse to make the zygote. But there's another process that's going on all around here. For example, like when I said, that this spore, let me not use blue. I want to get confused. Like when we said this spore is going to grow into this, right? Grow into something, right? Or for example, when we said this zygote here is going to grow into an embryo and then a young plant. And then that embryo young plant is going to grow here, right? So what process did we already learn about that is involved in growing things, right? Growing these skin cells, growing things like that. And so that's hopefully mitosis. So even though it's not on this in every step, just know that mitosis is occurring like all the time, basically, because in order for a sporophyte plant to make a sporangium, you're going to have mitosis. In order for a sporangium to make spore mother cells, you're going to have mitosis. In order for a spore to grow into a gametophyte plant, you need mitosis. In order for a gametophyte plant to grow organs on its body to make sperm and egg, you're going to need mitosis, right? Likewise, in order for sperm and egg to be made, you're going to need cells. You're going to need to undergo mitosis in the sex organs. You get the idea, right? So mitosis is happening all the time. I'm just pointing that out here. They're not it's not separate, right? It's like you're having growth occur throughout the plant life cycle, right? So you have to have mitosis, and that's the case. Whew, I know. Breathe it out. Ooh, man, this is really a lot of information. It's okay. Just know that all of the labs from here on, we're going to be talking about alternation of generation. So this is your introduction to it. But these terms, antheridium, archegonium, sporophyte plant, gametophyte plant, we're going to be using them for every single class from here on out. So just stay with me. It will become easier with the repetition, right? It will become easier. All right. So we just looked at alternation of generations with like, oops, this is the wrong, with boxes, right? With boxes. And that's fine to kind of understand the cycle. But let's look at it with a real plant. So the fern plants are the easiest plant to understand alternation of generations because all of the steps are very visible with the eye, right? So often we use the fern plant as an example. Okay, so let's walk through it. So here we go. We have at the very top, and I use the same color coding, I think. Yes, same color coding here. So blue is going to be diploid, and gold or yellow is going to represent haploid, right? Okay. So here's our sporophyte plant, right at the very top. Let me get blue since we're talking, right? This guy here. Oops, what happened to my annotate? This is our sporophyte plant right there. And that sporophyte plant has on its leaves are these little clusters. You'll learn about what those clusters are in the fern lab. But on the leaves of fern plants are sporangia, right? That's the plural. And what do sporangia do? They make spores. So here we have a picture of one sporangium, one. And inside of there, let's see what happens inside of there. So inside of that sporangium, there's the spore mother cells that are diploid. And those spore mother cells are going to undergo the process of meiosis to produce the 4 haploid spores. Notice the color change, right, from blue to gold, because we just went from diploid to haploid via meiosis. Those 4 spores for each mother cell, 4 spores, are going to break apart and eventually get released into the air. So each of these little dots is a spore. Get released into the air, fall on the ground, and then through mitosis, going to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually become what's called the gametophyte plant. It grew. So it went from one single cell spore to kind of a green blob, and then ultimately kind of like this heart-shaped looking gametophyte plant. On that gametophyte plant, there's sex organs. There's sex organs that make eggs, which are called archegonia, plural, or one archegonium. So here, and then there's sex organs. So I don't know if you can see this little line. At the top of the heart are these little pokey things, and those are all archegonia. And then toward the bottom of the heart, these are the other little dots, and those are the antheridia. And so let's look at one. I think I do that, right? Yeah. So let's get this back. So this is a group of archegonia. Down here is a group of antheridia. Here is one archegonium. Remember, singular. Here is one antheridium, right? Singular. So inside of that archegonium is an egg. You can see it here. I'll draw it. I'll draw it in red just to make it obvious. There's an egg right there. And inside of the antheridium are sperm, which will ultimately get released, right? So here's a sperm leaving. Eventually, here, I go back. Eventually, the egg, which is in the archegonium, is going to be met by a sperm. Here's a sperm. Sperm fused with the egg, and now we have egg and sperm fused together. One haploid egg plus one haploid, right? One N. Haploid sperm fuses together, makes 2 or diploid, 2N diploid zygote. Notice the color change. Here we go. 2N zygote cell. 2N zygote cell is going to undergo mitosis and grow into, new sporophyte plant. So you can see here we see the zygote cell has grown into the young plant, and the young plant at this point is still attached to the gametophyte plant. So the sporophyte plant is still attached to the gametophyte plant at this point. Why? Well, because egg stays, right? Egg, so sperm here, look. Sperm leaves. Here's sperm inside the antheridium. Here's sperm that is left, right? Sperm leaves the antheridium. Egg stays. Egg doesn't go anywhere. Egg stays put in the antheridium. So if the egg is there, sperm will come to the egg. Here's your 2N zygote, but the 2N zygote is going to grow where the egg was, right? Because the egg stays. So here's our 2N zygote. This is the result of egg and sperm coming together, right? Still inside of the archegonium, right? Because egg stays. Egg didn't go anywhere, so sperm met egg in the archegonium, and that's where the 2N zygote is going to grow. Here is the zygote now has grown into a young plant, but it's still, because the egg was stuck inside of the archegonium, it's still going to be attached to this gametophyte plant, right? I think I even draw it. Yep. But eventually in the ferns, the sporophyte plant, or the young embryo, is going to grow into a new sporophyte plant. And eventually it won't need the gametophyte plant anymore, and it will grow its own roots, it'll grow its own leaves and everything. And so it'll go on to repeat this whole cycle again of alternation of generations. Okay. So as you can see, it's good to think of, we still have here two organisms that are existing for one life cycle. But it's not quite the same as the caterpillar or butterfly thing, because in the case of the caterpillar or butterfly, the caterpillar is diploid and the butterfly is diploid. And that's not what we have in the plants. Okay. Again, don't be overwhelmed. I know it's a lot of new information. This is brand new, probably, concept to you guys, but we're going to have a lot of repetition with it. And we're going to learn about alternation of generations in different plant phyla, including the ferns eventually, which we had kind of a crash course through right now. But I'm setting this up for you so it makes sense when we talk about it later. Is there is a switch. So for some plants, the gametophyte generation is the dominant generation, and for some plants, the sporophyte generation is the dominant generation. What I mean by dominant is, it is the most, that the plant life cycle of that plant exists mostly as that generation. So for example, let's look here. In the more primitive plants, and we're going to talk about them today, the nonvascular plants. In the more primitive plants, the gametophyte generation is dominant. So we'll go into it, but what I mean when I say dominant is the gametophyte generation is free living. So it lives on its own, free living, all by itself. And the plant life cycle of those plants, the mosses, liverworts, hornworts, the plant exists mostly as a gametophyte generation. And then the sporophyte generation is really short-lived, and the sporophyte generation is not free living. However, in the subsequent labs, we're going to learn about the more higher evolved plants that are a bit more complex, and those have the sporophyte generation dominant. So for all of the vascular plants, the sporophyte generation is dominant. So the plants that we looked at in the very first lab, right? Flowering dogwood, dawn redwood, Douglas fir, all of those guys that we looked at, Japanese maple, all of those plants are examples of flowering plants. And so those plants are the sporophyte plant. Like if you look at a Douglas fir tree, you are looking at the sporophyte plant, and the gametophyte generation is very hard to see. So gametophyte generation dominant in the non-vascular plants, sporophyte generation is dominant in the vascular plants. And we'll learn more about that. I'm just setting you up for it now. Okay. Here we'll look through just a little bit of a shift. So here's an example of plants where the gametophyte generation is dominant. So maybe you have seen moss before. this green stuff all over these rocks is moss. Here's a close-up of the moss. And in the mosses, gametophyte generation is dominant. So believe it or not, all of that green stuff that you're looking at, that's haploid. That is a haploid plant individual. Eventually in the mosses, the green haploid plant individual, which is the gametophyte plant, eventually will grow into will produce a sporophyte plant, which will have to stay attached to the gametophyte plant. So we say this in the mosses and all the non-vascular plants, that the gametophyte is dominant because it's free living, and it is the thing. Most of the time when you see moss, it looks like this, and that's gametophyte generation. Ferns, and this is another reason why we use ferns as a example to understand the life cycle of alternation of generations, is because in ferns you start to see a shift where you still can see with your eyes the gametophyte generation and the sporophyte generation, but you're starting to see sporophyte generation becoming dominant. So just so you know, I'll use the same colors. Oh, not chat. I'll use the same colors I used before. Here is that heart-shaped thing. This is the gametophyte plant of a fern, right? Here's a slightly bigger one. On the left heart-shaped one, the gametophyte plant, we have, oops, nope, no. Oh, okay. We're back. Sorry about that. How come I can't get back? Maybe I can get it back. Yep, cool. On the left gametophyte plant, we have the archegonium, and then on the bottom, the antheridia. On the right gametophyte plant, we already see that egg and sperm have come together and the sporophyte plant is growing. So here's the first leaf of the sporophyte plant. Here's the radicle of the sporophyte plant, still attached to the gametophyte plant. And as I said on the previous slides, when we're talking about ferns, eventually the sporophyte plant is going to grow even more roots and more leaves, and the gametophyte plant will go away. So this is an example. Ferns are an example where we start to see a transition from the sporophyte, from the gametophyte plant being dominant to the sporophyte plant being dominant. Right. And oh yeah, so here you go. So when you look at a fern, for example, on the right you see a fern, you're looking at the sporophyte generation. That's the dominant generation in the ferns. This is just that same thing I showed on the previous slide. Here's your young baby plant growing out of the gametophyte, because that's where the egg was. But ultimately, gametophyte's going to go away. And when you look at a fern, you're just looking at sporophyte plant. So sporophyte dominant, free living, and it's the stage that lasts the most during the life cycle. And then for all the other plants, for the most part, sporophyte is dominant. So in this example of flowering plants, every single plant you see in here, you're looking at the sporophyte plant. Okay, take a break if you want to. I know it's a lot of information. Now I'll keep going, but so now we've learned about mitosis and meiosis. We've learned about alternation of generations. We've learned about a switch in dominance from gametophyte generation to sporophyte generation. We've learned a lot in this class already. Now we're going to start to talk about the different players in the plant kingdom. And today we're going to talk about the non-vascular plants. So you might remember from the very first lecture or lab or class that we have this schematic, right, of all of the plants in the plant kingdom. And this is what I showed at the beginning of this class. So we're today going to talk about these guys, right? The non-vascular plants, the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts. The non-vascular plants collectively are called the bryophytes. Bryophytes. When you see the word phytes, plural, like that, like bryophytes, it's referring to phylum. Or sorry, no, don't. Take that back, rewind. Just know that the non-vascular plants are also called the bryophytes. Just leave it at that. the bryophytes. Bryophytes are non-vascular plants. Bryophytes are non-vascular plants. Here they are. You have moss, you have liverworts, and you have hornworts. So you may be familiar with moss. You're probably not that familiar with a liverwort or a hornwort. Don't worry, we will get familiar with it today. So hornworts, which we'll talk about toward the end of the class, are in the phylum. So remember in our first class, we talked about biological taxonomy, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, all those things down to genus and specific epithet. Yeah, some of you got those questions on the exam about that incorrect. So maybe go back to that first lecture to better understand how, what is a genus and what is a species and what is a phylum, if you got that wrong. But so hornworts are in the phylum Anthocerophyta. And this is what I was trying to say before that I was getting wrong. If you see the ending phyta, you're talking about a phylum. All phylums end with phyta at the end. So hornworts are in Anthocerophyta. We'll talk about them at the end of the class. Liverworts are in the phylum Marchantiophyta. Remember, if you see phyta, you're in a phylum. So liverworts are in the phylum Marchantiophyta. And mosses are in the phylum Bryophyta. Phyta means phylum. And collectively, those three phyla, right? Phyla is plural of phylum. Those three phyla are called the non-vascular plants or the bryophytes. You might notice that the phylum name for moss has the same beginning as that bryophytes, right? Which collectively describes all three of these guys. That's because moss was the first to be described. And so when moss was being described, it was being described as non-vascular plants. So they kind of said, oh, okay, they must all be mosses. And then ultimately learned about other non-vascular plants and they got lumped together in the bryophytes. Okay, let's talk about these guys. So that's what I was saying. This bryo, right? Bryo is derived from the Greek word for moss. So as I was saying in the previous, when they first were describing the non-vascular plants, they were all mosses, and so they thought that only mosses were the non-vascular plants, and then later these others were described as, and they were also non-vascular, so they're in that same thing. So non-vascular plants are non-vascular, which we'll talk about, I think, on the next. Yep. Non-vascular plants, all three of these guys require water for sexual reproduction. So the sperm of these plants swims, and it needs water in order to swim to the egg. All of these guys. But the word saying that they're non-vascular actually refers to this. So these plants do not have xylem tissue, and these plants do not have phloem tissue. These plants have to be very, very small because of that, because they don't have a good way to conduct water and food like sugar. So they have to be super, super small, and they have to absorb things kind of like a sponge. And they don't have like veins and things like that. So they're non-vascular. They lack xylem and phloem. These plants also, just some background about them. A lot of times you might see them growing on rocks or a sidewalk or something that, not very, not like nice soil. And that's because they can live on areas that are like disturbed. So for example, we call them pioneer plants, or we call them early successional. Don't worry about that too much. But what that means is if you have something like, let's say a volcano erupts and covers the whole land with lava, and then it dries, right? But all the plants are killed. Moss or liverworts and hornworts can actually be the first plants to arrive there and start to grow. That's also why they can grow on a rock, or why they can grow on a sidewalk or like the side of your house. They can live in a lot of different habitats, but they tend to be in moist tropical and temperate forests because remember, they need water for the sperm to swim. But there are some species of mosses, liverworts, and hornworts that can live in really, really extreme environments. So some of them live in deserts, believe it or not. Some of them live in the cold. Some of them grow on other plants. So remember, they have to be really short. So maybe you're in a tropical forest and there's all these tall trees. Well, I don't get any sun. So that maybe they will grow on the tree in order to be able to get sun. So some of these species can live in really, really extreme environments, but they will still at some point need water in order for the sperm to swim to the egg. So like in a desert, for example, you tend not to have a lot of water, but then one day, whammo, you get water and then the sperm can swim to the egg. So, okay. Here are just some nice pictures to kind of take a break of talking about all this stuff. So this is taken, I think, in Connecticut. You could see a big rock there that's covered in moss. You could also see a downed log. I shouldn't use green. Here, I'll use yellow. No, I'll use purple. Right? You see this down log right here, covered in moss. Here's the rock, covered in moss. There's another rock covered in moss. So this is going back to that idea that they can just grow on, early successional, right? They can grow on things that are not like nice soil. Here's some more non-vascular plants growing on this log. This is a close-up of them growing kind of in a water, like a boggy environment where they're like kind of swampy. This is a nice collection. This picture actually shows mosses, 2 different types of mosses at least, and liverworts in this picture. Here are some nice liverworts in the middle. So all of these pictures were taken in Connecticut. This is all liverworts. Over here, this is all types of moss here. So this is remember I said that they can live in extreme environments. So check out this moss that's living under the snow. No problem. Having a great day living under that snow. Okay. So as I mentioned previously, all of the non-vascular plants have the gametophyte generation as dominant. What that means is that the sporophyte generation in the non-vascular plants is never free living. The sporophyte generation always has to stay attached to the gametophyte generation. Gametophyte generation is free living. It can just do its own thing, but the sporophyte generation always remains attached to the gametophyte generation. So in the bryophytes or the non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is larger than the sporophyte plant. It's photosynthetic. So as you saw in this, it's green, right? These are all green. And these are all the gametophytes. So gametophyte is larger than the sporophyte, photosynthetic, long-lived. So it's the thing that you see more commonly if you see the species. Totally independent of the sporophyte, does not need to be attached to the sporophyte, whereas the sporophyte has to be attached to the gametophyte. And then as we have learned, if you're a gametophyte plant, you're a plant that makes gametes, and therefore you have to be a haploid plant, right? 1N. Okay. The gametophytes, as we learned in the non-vascular plants, the gametophytes make egg and sperm, right? Gametophyte, gametes, fight plant, gametophyte. So the gametophyte plants are going to make egg and sperm. And as we already learned, the eggs are going to be made in the female sex organs, which are the archegonia, and the male sex organs are the antheridia, are going to make the sperm. Each archegonia only holds 1 egg. One archegonium has 1 egg in it. So 1 egg per archegonium. One antheridium can make many, 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 many sperm. And this is just a reminder of these new terms that we covered earlier. Okay, let's look at what they look like. So here is a microscope slide of several archegonia. And so like, let's circle one of them. This is one archegonium, right? So the archegonium, it's a female sex organ. It's haploid, right? Actually, I guess we'll stick with our color scheme. Here's one archegonium. It's haploid, and the parts of it are a short stalk so that's just where it's attached. Here's the short stalk. It's just where it's attached to the gametophyte plant. A swollen area that holds the egg cell. The word is venter. You don't need to know that term, but you might see that term on some of these slides. So the venter is just this swollen part. And that dark thing in the middle is the egg. And then a very long neck where the sperm will swim down. So here's the neck. When the egg is ready, the cells of this neck will break down and the egg will send chemical signals which will attract sperm, and sperm will swim down the neck to the venter to fertilize the egg. So that was the female sex organs. Let's look at the male sex organs. So here is male sex organ, or an antheridium. This is just one antheridium shown on this slide. There's that one cut off here on the side of it. It's a male sex organ. It's also haploid, right? Because it's part of the gametophyte plant. And it consists of a short stalk, which attaches it to the gametophyte plant. Short stalk. A covering of cells that just protect the contents. So that's this here, just a covering of sterile cells that help protect. And then lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of sperm producing cells inside of one antheridium. So let's just see. Yeah. So the sperm producing cells look very uniform. So all of this here is many, many of these sperm producing cells. And it looks really uniform to the eye. So it's like easier to tell it apart from, say, this, right? Here you see one dark spot and a long neck and a swelling. Here, just think it's very uniform tissue, and that's those sperm producing cells. And those sperm producing cells, and a word you might see some places is just this thing, spermatogenous. I'm fine with sperm producing cells, but just so you know, sperma means sperm. Genus means comes from, like genus, so like the genesis, right? So it's just saying it's cells that are the beginnings of sperm, but sperm producing cells is fine. Okay. Water, right? So remember, all these non-vascular plants require water to have the sperm swim. So at some point in its life, it has to have rain or mist or dew to allow the sperm to swim to the egg. So here's a nice schematic. The sperm swims to the egg, and the result of the fusion of that is the 2N zygote. Okay. And that 2N zygote is the beginning of the sporophyte generation. So there you go. Sporophyte generation begins, and it will grow from that 2N zygote into a full plant. Here is a slide showing this is the result. So this here is egg and sperm already came together. And here is what is already an embryo. The 2N zygote has already grown into an embryo. Remember, I was saying before, the embryo is still inside of the archegonium because the egg stays. Egg doesn't move, and so the embryo is going to grow where the egg was. Eventually, for the non-vascular plants, most of them have these parts. So the sporophyte plant, here it is again, growing out of the archegonium. And most of the non-vascular plants have a foot, which connects it to the gametophyte plant, a seta, which is just a stalk, and a capsule, which has the contents. So here, I think I break it down on the following slides. Yeah, yeah, I do. And so just remember from earlier, right? Sporangium, or the plural sporangia, is the structure organ that produces the spores, right? So sometimes you might see the word capsule. Capsule and sporangium are the same thing. Okay, right. So this is what I was just saying before. The foot of the sporophyte plant attaches to the gametophyte plant. That's where the sporophyte plant is going to be held in place. It's also, remember, the sporophyte plant can't make its own food and it cannot make its own water. It's going to get that. This is in the non-vascular plants. It's going to get that from the gametophyte plant. So the foot is also where it's going to be able to absorb water and mineral nutrients from the gametophyte plant. The seta is just a stalk that elevates the capsule or the sporangium. If you're going to release spores, you want to have a little bit of elevation. And then the capsule or the sporangium is what has those spore mother cells inside, which are going to grow into spores. Or which will, sorry, which are going to undergo meiosis, right, to create those haploid spores. And those haploid spores will be what grows into the gametophyte plants. I think I'm going to do this in stages. How many slides do I have? Yeah. So this is the first part of this class. We've talked about meiosis. We've talked about mitosis. We've talked about what are the alternation of generations, how that works. And we've talked about non-vascular plants in general. I'm going to create an additional video for you to watch where we're going to talk about the individual players themselves, right? Because it's hard for me to do this at all in one sitting. So I'm going to pause here and click on the link that's in the Blackboard page for the second part of this class. And I'll see you there in a second.